Okay, welcome to Karen Guth, who is the author of the new book, Bubbies in Bidud. I have my copy right here. Karen, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much.
And tell us how this book came together and how you came to write it.
Well, I write a blog called Tell Me a Story, Bubie, and it's a blog for our Haredi children. There were many stories and values, quite honestly, that we weren't able to really pass to our Haredi children who live in Mea Shearim because there were books that they wouldn't allow in the house. Either the pictures weren't appropriate or they weren't, the stories themselves they felt were written by authors that weren't religious Jews. So I decided that I wanted to impart some of those values to our grandchildren and started writing this blog. And then I discovered that there were other grandparents who had grandchildren who had become very religious, ultra Orthodox, and were having the same problem as far as reading material to read them. So I thought, well, the next step is to illustrate some of these. And during the COVID, we were not able to see our grandchildren for a couple months. And we had gone every week since the oldest was born. He's about to be bar mitzvahed, God willing. And so within the story about the corona, decided to write a younger children's book. And that occurred when the head of our yeshiva came back from New York and we were all put into Bidud because in isolation because he had corona. And the kids didn't understand what that was. What does it mean that Bubie's in Bidud? So that's how it came about.
And how long did it take you to write this until completion? Because everything has changed so fast. You sure did publish a book pretty quickly.
Well, I wrote this when I went into Bidud was I believe it was in June, May or June. It was one of the elections we had. I remember I just voted, and the next week I was in Bidud. And I wrote the Bubie story, the longer story, and then this piece was within that story. And then it took until right before Hanukkah to get it published because the process was first I needed to find an illustrator, and Meital Kocher Maor, she and I had worked together on books that were published in Gush Etzion about Gush Katif and about the Intifada, and she had done illustrations for those books when she was in high school. And I contacted her mom, who lives in Efrat, and I said, "Is she still illustrating?" She says, "Yes." She's not only that, she has her own business, and she finished Betzalel. And I went to her website and loved her stuff, loved her illustrations, and called her, and she was available. So it took a few months for her to do the drawings. And then when we finished it, I decided, you know what, I really want to do this in Hebrew. So I contacted a former student. I'm a teacher at the Ulpan Rosh Tzurim in Makor Chaim, the yeshiva. And she had been a student of mine several years ago, Michal Yechieli. And I said, "Michal, could you translate this for me?" And she said, "Sure." I said, "I don't really care that every word is exactly word for word. I want to keep the rhyme." And she did a beautiful job on the translation. And then we had to decide if we were going to do two books, one in Hebrew and one in English. But because it's a children's book and it's so short, I said, you know what? And I'm an English teacher and I'm always encouraging people to learn English. I said, let's do it both one side English and one side Hebrew.
And here it is.
And there it is. We found a
Yes.
wonderful person in Alco Printing in Jerusalem, and Kobe did a wonderful job on printing it both sides.
And what has the reaction been? I mean, I know it just came out, but did you end up reading it to your grandkids?
Well, I did bring it to the grandchildren who were they were very excited about it. And every week, when is Bubie Dude going to be ready? When is it going to be ready? And they were very excited to read it because they saw themselves. They saw my husband and I, Bobby and Zeta, and they saw themselves. Now, their parents weren't as excited because it's in Hebrew and not in Yiddish, and they don't really like Hebrew books in the house unless it's Kodesh, unless it's holy books. And the girls, of course, and my grandson there were in colorful clothing rather than black because the girls wear black dresses and black capes. And so they weren't thrilled about that, but they didn't send it home with me. So it's still there, which was good news. We had to add another baby before the book was published. We had to change the last picture because we had another granddaughter born, and of course we had to add her in there. In the meantime, I've self-published. I do have a couple of publishers looking at it, but they told me it would take time before they'd get back to me, and I really wanted to have it out by Hanukkah. So, and I'm selling it. People are
Okay.
enjoying it because they, especially people who have both grandchildren who are either they're English speakers and their grandchildren are Hebrew speakers, or vice versa, and they like the idea of having it both in Hebrew and English.
And for them, maybe it wasn't an issue about clothing or anything. I mean, I guess this crosses demographics.
It does. It obviously the children and the Bobby and the Zeta are kind of dati lumi, modern Orthodox, but the pictures are so sweet, and the pastel colors are so enticing, I would say, that that it's something that I think all grandparents could share, all Jewish grandparents at least, because does have the Hebrew and the Babi and Zaidi, um, could share with their grandchildren.
Tell me about your other books on difficult subjects, because I understand you have more.
I have other stories. I'm now thinking about and talking to people about how to publish those. In the meantime, they're on my blog, Tell Me a Story, Bubby. But each of the stories relates to issues that the parents may not discuss. For example, we went. We took our grandchildren to the playground at Shalva, and they saw lots of children with different abilities, disabilities, and we talked about that, and I wrote a story about that. And the kids in Mea Shearim, they do see people, like we one time saw somebody who was walking with a stick who was blind. And so I wrote a story about somebody who was blind, and it's a children's story, and sometimes I use my grandchildren's names and sometimes I don't. I write about issues that have to do with disabilities. I actually have a disability. I walk with a severe limp because I had a hip replacement that failed, so I have one leg about 8 centimeters shorter than the other, and I have a lift on the shoe. And so I want my grandchildren to be sensitive to people with disabilities. There's a story about a boy who's hearing impaired, and also stories about things that they need to be careful. There's a story about somebody trying to lure a little girl over to them, and how the little girl handles it. and I have a very good friend who runs Tahel, which is the Association for Religious women, I think, and children who've experienced abuse, and she works a lot with children and how to protect children and how they can protect themselves. So I wrote a story about that. I'm also now writing a little bit about mental illness, which you see a lot in any community, but many communities, they may talk to the children about it or they may not, but in our children's community, they don't talk about those subjects.
And is this your first published book?
This is the first published book that I've written. I've edited other things that have been published. Um, these books that Gush Etzion did of children's creative writing, when there was an intifada here, and many of our children were afraid to go to Jerusalem or go to school. They didn't, they were scared, and they I gave them an outlet. We worked with teachers, English teachers, to enable the children to write about their feelings. And then, of course, when Jews were expelled from Gush Katif, uh, there were a lot of emotions here in Gush Etzion about that, and children had an opportunity to write about their feelings in poetry and creative pieces, and that was published by the Gush Etzion Foundation, and I was the creative editor for those.
And how do you think Bubbies and Bidud is going to age? Because, I mean, when the kids read it next year, because there's a page where you talk about waiting for the vaccine to come. And now we understand the vaccines have arrived. Of course, I don't know anyone who's actually taken it yet, but it's only a matter of time. And also the issue of the Intifada and Gush Katif, I don't know if people remember that anymore.
Well, I think those books were definitely for a specific period, and now they're history. Um, I had a very good friend who read this and said, you know what? I look forward to the day when I can read this to my grandchildren, and it's Agada. It's a story of something that we went through. And one of the things I notice about our grandchildren, they always want to hear stories about us when we were younger or things that happened to us. And this will turn into one of those stories. Remember the time when. And I often wonder how young children will be impacted by growing up during, depending on their age and how much they understand now. Some of our grandchildren really never have seen us without a mask on. And what does that mean to children growing up in a society, even for a year or 2 years or a year and a half, and all the adults around them have masks on their faces? So I think this is going to I think it's going to be something that kids will still want to hear about and talk about, and maybe even need to talk about after the inoculation, after the vaccine.
And let's talk about your teaching career. Where do you teach and how long has this been going on?
Well, I've been a teacher for about 35 years. I came to Israel. My husband and I and our two boys made Aliyah in 2000, and I came as a teacher with a master's degree in Jewish education, and also a teaching certificate from Denver, Colorado, from the state of Colorado, in English and social studies. But I also taught in the Jewish day schools on the Jewish side of the curriculum, Jewish history and philosophy and Hebrew. And then I got to Israel, and the average third grader actually knew more than I did. So I decided I better stick with English. But I have a lot of students here who made Aliyah. from Colorado, and they now are raising their families here. I've even had children of students. I said once I get grandchildren of students, I really have to retire. But I love teaching. I love teaching. I teach English. I'm the coordinator at Yeshivat Makor Chaim for English, and I've been teaching there almost since we moved. I started out having private groups come to the house when we first made Aliyah, and we did creative writing and literature. And I've been teaching at the Olpanat Rosh Tzurim for a number of years, and 17 years, I think now it's been. And I teach for Bagrut, I teach high school, and I love my students.
What happened when you made Aliyah in the year 2000, and maybe you didn't think that one day one of your sons is going to grow up and become Haredi and live in Mea Sharim and only want to speak Yiddish?
Well, we knew he was going in that direction in Denver. Um, he wanted to be, he was always looking for the Rebbe, the holy man. We have a second son who's a musician. He's currently living in Tel Aviv, and he writes music and he sells his music, and you can find him on Spotify and everything. He's also a photographer, and the one who, we didn't know how far he would go actually, but he's gone pretty much over to the dark side, as we jokingly say. And he's very strict. He and his wife have a very strict notion about what the kids should see and how the kids should dress, and what they should be exposed to. And I think probably some of it is good. Our grandchildren, we play games with them. They don't have an iPhone or a computer, and they're happy to play dreidel and jacks and rummy cube and all of those kind of games that kids don't really play anymore because they're involved with things on their smartphones and computers. But it's a challenge for us. They don't come to our house. They come once in a while, but they won't eat in our house. And we can't take them to places where there are a lot of people because they don't want them seeing the way other people dress. So we can't do, those regular Bubie and Zeta things that grandparents do. But we have to look at the cup as half full.
But
They're
it's
really special kids.
but they're in the book.
They're in the book, and I actually saved them each a book and wrote a special message to them also in Yiddish. I've learned a little bit of Yiddish so that when they get older, they'll have a copy of it.
And what's up next for Karen Guth? Are you going to write more books, or what do you want to do with your blog?
Well, I'd like to publish the stories in the blog. It's just I haven't decided, and I would like to, discuss it with a publisher if I should publish them as a book of short stories. Tell me a story, Bubby, but then there might be a couple of volumes eventually. And I've got about 25 stories on the blog, and I also want to get them translated, so I'm going to have to have some money to do that, and illustrate it, not like this is illustrated, but maybe an illustration for each story. So I would like to eventually publish them also. um, Actually, my youngest son gave me the idea of doing a Bubby's bookshelf, and Bubby's Bookshelf hopefully will become a site of books and even video that are recommended for grandparents to read to their uh, religious grandchildren. And there are lots of books out there. I love to read children's literature, so I would recommend these books as books for grandparents to buy and read to their grandchildren. And nowadays you can, read on Zoom, you can read You can share, a Kindle, have the story on Kindle, and have questions prepared to discuss with the grandparents. One of the things I like to do in my stories also is I'll ask a question when I'm reading the story, and the question's in the story, and I've read these to my grandchildren, some of them, and I ask them, well, what would you do in that situation? So I also want to create a dialogue, a thinking dialogue between grandparents and grandchildren.
I like that. Thank you. Um, Before we go, I want to talk about your husband and your son. What's your son's music so we can look him up?
He's calls himself Troubadour Adam Road. And my husband, well, my husband has a podcast, and he interviews ham radio people. I I don't know if they're called hams, but and he's archiving the stories of these amazing people who have had influence in the space program, in innovating all kinds of technology, and their stories, nobody's really ever told their stories, and so he's telling those stories now. And he's also doing virtual ham conventions now that things have shut down, and there are no more face-to-face conventions for a while, at least.
And that's called QSO Today.
That's QSO Today.
Okay.
That's his that's his interview, his podcast, and the QSO Today Convention Expo.
And what's your website and where can we get your book?
The website, it's in the book. It's Tell Me a Story, Bubie. It's a Weebly. I also have another website it's called English Teaching with Creativity, and that's for teachers to use for creative ideas for teaching English in the classroom. And then the Tell Me a Story, Bubie, is on there. You can press a link to buy the book. I plan on putting it on Amazon also, but I hope to have that up within the next week or so.
Okay. And Bubby is spelled Bubie.
Yes. And then there'll be Bubby's bookshelf. So I hope that'll be done. But, I'm teaching full time. And so now in this crazy time, I'm in Zoom for a class, and then I'm driving to the yeshiva or the Opana and teaching a class in frontal teaching, and then I'm driving back and doing a Zoom class. It's kind of a crazy time, so I'm working full time while I'm doing all of this. I also in 2016 completed a doctorate in education, so I'm a pretty busy person.
Well, this has been Karen Guth. The new book is called Bubbies and Bidud, and thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you very much, Ben. I really appreciate it.